I still remember first time I heard about the Walker family. Henry, his wife Sarah, and their two children, Lily and Thomas. Back in 1996, I was just a young man living in town, working odd jobs and keeping my head down. People used to talk about them in hushed voices, the kind of voices reserved for those who seemed both admirable and strange. They had chosen to leave behind the conveniences of modern life, electricity, running water, cable television, supermarkets, and build themselves a life off-grid deep in the pine choke woods outside our county. Some admired their courage. Others called them foolish. But everyone agreed they were different. I never met them personally back then, though I'd driven past a trailhead leading into their land once or twice. The hand-painted sign nailed to a tree that read, "Walker's Place. Keep out," told you everything you needed to know. They wanted solitude. They wanted their own rules. They wanted to disappear from the noise of the world. And in 1996, they did just that, though not in the way anyone expected. What makes it all the more chilling is that their disappearance wasn't noticed immediately. You'd think an entire family suddenly vanishing would raise alarms. But the Walkers had cut off most contact long before then. The kids didn't go to public school. Sarah homeschooled them. They didn't go to town except once in a while for basic supplies, salt, flour, maybe kerosene for lamps. They had a garden, chickens, goats, and Henry was a capable hunter. When they stopped showing up in town, no one thought much of it. Maybe they're snowed in. Maybe Henry's hunting deep. Maybe Sarah had another baby, and they're staying close. People shrugged it off because the Walkers had made it clear they didn't want to be part of us anymore. So, in 1996, when they disappeared, it wasn't like anyone was keeping tabs. They simply slipped off the edge of the map. I didn't think much of them again until a decade later. By then, I was older, working as a county surveyor, which meant I often had to trek into remote areas checking landlines, forest boundaries, and abandoned lots. It was lonely work, but I liked it. I'd take my pack, my compass, my maps, and head into the wilderness for days. That's how I stumbled across the Walker cabin in 2006. I hadn't been looking for it. My work didn't even bring me that far out. But a storm had come to the previous night, knocking down trees across old paths. And as I bushwhacked my way around a tangle of fallen branches, I found myself staring at the clearing I knew wasn't on any of my maps. And there it was, the cabin, a sagging, moss-draped skeleton of log and timber. Its roof half collapsed, the windows punched out like empty eyes. Something about the place felt wrong the second I saw it, like it was watching me. I can't explain that kind of thing, you just know. At first, I thought it was just another long-forgotten shack. We have plenty of those in the woods, places built by old trappers or hermits that eventually rot into the ground. But when I stepped closer, I noticed details. A rusted tricycle lying in the grass, its paint chipped to bare metal. A child's shoe half buried in the dirt. The remains of a chicken coop sagging beside the cabin. This wasn't just some hermit shack. It was a family home. And something about it tugged at the back of my memory. Walker. That's what it was. This was the Walker family's cabin. I don't know why, but my stomach turned cold when the realization hit. The place looked abandoned for years. Maybe a decade, maybe more. But there was a heaviness in the air that made me feel like I had just walked into a graveyard. My boots crunched on broken glass as I climbed the warped steps to the porch. The front door hung open, creaking on one hinge. I stepped inside and the smell hit me. It wasn't a smell of mold or damp wood that I was used to. This was sweeter, fouler, like rot baked into the walls. My first thought was animals, maybe raccoons or deer carcasses, but as I walked further in, I realized it was something else. Something older. Something human. The cabin was a time capsule. Dishes still sat on the table, their rims crusted with what looked like the dried remains of stew. A child's notebook lay open on the floor, its pencil drawing smeared with water damage. Coats hung on pegs by the door, eaten by moths. It was as if the family had simply stood up one day and vanished, leaving everything behind. But that smell, it dragged me to the back of the cabin, toward a door that hung slightly ajar. My hand shook when I pushed it open. Inside was a cellar, a set of wooden steps descending into darkness. And that's when I saw them. Maggots. The cellar floor was alive with them, a writhing white carpet of larvae that glistened under the weak shaft of light filtering from above. My first instinct was to gag. The second was to step closer, because scattered among the seething movement of maggots were bones. Human bones. The skull lay tilted on its side, its jaw open in a silent scream, teeth still intact. Ribs jutted from the mess like broken fence posts. And not just one skeleton, several. My knees nearly gave out as I realized what I was seeing. This wasn't just some animal that had crawled down here and died. These were the walkers. Or at least what was left of them. The scene is burned into my mind even now, all these years later. The cellar told the truth that no one had known for a decade. The walkers hadn't simply moved deeper into the woods or packed up to start a new life elsewhere. They had died right here, in their own cabin. Their remains left to decay until time and nature stripped them to bone. And the maggots, they were the only ones who hadn't forgotten them. I stumbled back up the stairs, my chest tight, my head buzzing with the horror of it. I barely made it outside before I doubled over, retching into the weeds. My legs felt like lead as I staggered away from the cabin, but something inside me kept pulling me back. Questions. How had they died? Why had no one come looking? What happened in that dark, rotting place that led to an entire family lying in a cellar grave? And worst of all, why did I feel like I wasn't alone out there? The woods around the cabin were deathly silent. No bird song, no rustling of leaves, no wind through the pines. Just silence, thick and suffocating. And in that silence, I swore I could hear something faint. A whisper, a child's laugh, an echo of footsteps inside the cabin, though I stood outside on the porch. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the cabin itself had reached out and taken hold of me. That was the beginning of everything. The discovery that would unravel my life, drag the truth into daylight, and reveal horrors that had been buried beneath the earth for 10 long years. And though I didn't know it then, the maggots weren't just feeding on the past. They were keeping secrets alive. I didn't sleep that night after finding the Walker cabin. I drove straight back to town. The image of those writhing maggots and hollow skulls haunted me every time I closed my eyes. My hands shook on the wheel the whole way, and more than once, I had to pull over just to breathe. By the time I reached my apartment, I was drenched in sweat, and though the air was cool, I couldn't shake the feeling that something from that cellar had followed me back. It was irrational, I told myself. Just nerves, just shock. But even as I stripped off my mud-stained clothes and sat on the edge of my bed, I swore I could still smell that stench of rot clinging to me. The next morning, I did what any sane man would. I called the sheriff department. Sheriff Dalton was an old-school type, gruff and skeptical of anything he couldn't see for himself. I told him everything. The collapsed cabin, the tricycle, the cellar full of bones. He listened in silence, then sighed heavy into the receiver. "You been out in those woods too long, son?" he asked. My jaw clenched. I know what I saw. After some back and forth, he finally agreed to send a deputy with me to check it out. But his tone told me he thought it was nothing but my imagination mixed with some old deer carcass. Deputy Miller came along that afternoon. He was younger than me, all crisp uniform and clean boots, still carrying that air of cocky disbelief that comes with not having seen real horror yet. I led him through the woods, back along the storm-damaged path, until we reached the clearing. The cabin looked even worse in daylight. Every angle sagging, every board gray with rot. Miller sneered at it, muttering, "Creepy as hell." I didn't answer. I just pushed forward, heart hammering, as we stepped onto that porch again. When we got to the cellar, the smell rose up like a wall. Miller gagged immediately, pulling his shirt over his mouth. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "That's not a deer." His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing square on the bones. The light reflected off a child's skull, and I saw Miller freeze, the blood draining from his face. The maggots were still there, crawling over remains as if the last decade hadn't passed at all. That was the moment his disbelief vanished. He scrambled up the steps, nearly knocking me over, and once outside, he doubled over in the weeds. "We gotta call this in," he gasped. Within hours, the cabin was swarming, not with maggots this time, but with deputies, forensic teams, and county officials. Yellow tape went up around the clearing. Photographers snapped pictures of the cellar. Men in gloves carefully bagged bones. I stood off to the side, arms crossed tight, feeling sick as I watched strangers handle what had once been the Walker family. Sheriff Dalton arrived last, his face pale under his wide-brim hat. He gave me a look that was half accusation, half respect. "You weren't lying," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No, I wish I was." The official story began to form quickly. The sheriff called an unsolved tragedy. Maybe carbon monoxide poisoning, he suggested. Maybe food gone bad, a disease, or a fire that choked them in their sleep. But those were just words for the newspapers. The truth was, no one really knew what had happened. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no bullet casings, no bloodstains. Just bones, rotted clothing, and that cellar full of crawling white larvae. The case went cold as soon as it was opened. There was too much time between their deaths and the discovery. Too much decay. Too many unanswered questions. For the county, it became a sad footnote. Off-grid family found deceased in cabin, cause unknown. For me, it became something much darker. Because I couldn't stop thinking about the details. Why were they all in the cellar? Why hadn't anyone tried to leave? The dishes on the table. The coat still on the wall. They didn't die scattered or fleeing. They went down there together, like they'd been hiding. But hiding from what? Every time I turned that question over my head, I remember the silence of the woods, the whispers I swore I heard that first day. It felt like the trees themselves were keeping a secret. After the discovery, I started digging. I went through old county records, news archives, and library microfilm, chasing any mention of the Walkers. That's when the unease really took root, because the deeper I looked, the stranger it got. In the year before their disappearance, there had been multiple reports, unconfirmed, buried in local gossip columns, of strange lights in the forest near their land. Neighbors, the few that lived within 10 miles, claimed they heard screams at night, echoing across the hills. One man swore he saw Sarah Walker walking alone down the county road at dawn, barefoot and dazed, before vanishing back into the trees. None of it was investigated seriously. The Walkers were eccentric, private, off-grid. People chalked it up to them being different. But reading those old reports, knowing what I had seen in that cellar, made my blood run cold. I found one more thing that rattled me even more. Buried in the archives was a letter to the editor written in 1995 by Sarah Walker herself. In it, she warned of a darkness moving the woods. She wrote about hearing voices outside their cabin at night, about their livestock dying suddenly, about the children waking up with scratches on their arms. "The land is cursed," she wrote. "But Henry says we must endure. We cannot go back to the poise of the world. We must fight it here." At the time, the paper printed the letter as a curiosity, a rambling piece from a woman gone stir-crazy in the wilderness. But now, 10 years later, with their bones in the cellar, it read more like a confession. I showed the sheriff the letter, but he brushed it off. "Superstitious nonsense," he said. "Living out there breaks people's minds. That's all this is." But I couldn't accept that. I had seen the cellar. I had felt the weight of that silence. Something more had happened to Walkers, something darker than a tragic accident. And though the county was ready to bury it, I couldn't let it go. That was the start of my obsession. Night after night, I pored over every scrap of information, every rumor, every whisper. And the more I learned, the more I began to feel it. The same pull that must have kept the Walkers there, the same presence Sarah had written about. Sometimes, late at night, when I was alone in my apartment, I swore I heard the faint sound of children laughing in the next room. Sometimes, I'd wake up to the smell of rot, sharp and sudden, only to find nothing there. The cabin had infected me, and I couldn't shake it. The truth was buried out there in those woods, and whether I liked it or not, I was already being dragged into it. After the official investigation wrapped up, the county moved on, just as I knew they would. The newspaper printed a small article, barely half a page, with a photo of deputies carrying bags from the cabin. "Remains found of off-grid family," the headline read, followed by a neat paragraph about the Walkers' tragic lifestyle choice and the mystery of their end. By the next week, the story was buried under local politics and football scores. People didn't want to dwell on it. They wanted to forget, but I couldn't. I carried that cellar in my mind everywhere I went, a wound that wouldn't heal. The first time I went back to the cabin, it was barely a month after the discovery. I told myself it was for closure, but the truth was darker. I needed to see it again. Needed to prove to myself I hadn't imagined the whispers, the sense of something watching me. The trail was easy to follow now, beaten down by boots from deputies and surveyors. But the woods were just as oppressive. When I stepped into the clearing, I felt it immediately. That same suffocating silence. The yellow police tape still fluttered weakly around the perimeter, half torn by wind, and the cabin slouched deeper into ruin, as though it had aged another 10 years in the span of one. Inside, the air was still heavy with the stink of rot, though the bones had been taken away. The cellar seemed alive with memory. I stood at the top of the steps, staring into the dark. That was when I noticed something the sheriff's men had missed. Carvings in the wooden beam just beside the cellar door. They weren't initials or casual marks. They were deliberate symbols, crude but intentional. Circles with crosses, jagged lines that looked like eyes, and a series of hash marks like someone counting days. My chest tightened as I traced them with my fingertips. These weren't the markings of someone bored or idle. They were desperate, ritualistic. That night, I copied the carvings into a notebook and drove to the library. Hours bled away as I combed through folklore collections, anthropology texts, and old local histories. To my shock, some of the symbols matched sketches I found in a forgotten book about Appalachian witchcraft, dated to the late 1800s. According to the book, the markings were meant to ward off the hollow ones, spirits said to live in the forest, feeding on the living until only husks remained. My rational mind told me it was just folklore, backwoods superstition. But another part of me whispered, Sarah Walker believed in them, and maybe she had a reason. The more I dug, the more tangled the threads became. Old-timers in town remembered hearing strange stories about the land where the Walkers built their cabin. They said it had once been the site of a homestead in the 1800s, a farmstead that burned to the ground after the family living there went mad and killed each other. No one ever rebuilt on the land until the Walkers a century later. One man, a retired logger named Harris, told me flat out, that land don't want people. It spits them out. Always has. He wouldn't say more, just shook his head and walked away. I should have let it go. I should have turned my back and accepted that the Walkers' deaths were tragic, inexplicable, and best left buried. But the deeper I went, the less I could stop. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of gravity, that slow, undeniable tug forward. Every night, I dreamt of the cellar. Sometimes I saw the skulls grinning up at me, maggots writhing from their sockets. Sometimes I saw Sarah Walker, her face pale and gaunt, standing at the foot of my bed, whispering words I couldn't understand. And sometimes, worst of all, I dreamt I was in the cabin myself, trapped, listening to something moving in the dark just outside the door. By the fall of that year, I knew I had to return again. This time, I brought a recorder, hoping to capture any sound, any evidence that might explain what I felt. The woods were colder, the leaves fallen, the earth damp with rot. The clearing was just as silent, but now the silence felt almost expectant, like it had been waiting for me. I set the recorder on the kitchen table of the cabin, pressed play, and sat in the dark for hours. At first, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. But then, around midnight, I heard it, soft, almost indistinguishable, but clear on the tape when I played it back later. The sound of child's laughter, high-pitched, fleeting, followed by the scrape of something on wood. I wasn't dreaming it. The recorder caught it. When I took the tape to Sheriff Dalton, he barely glanced at it. Could be anything, he said. Wind, animals, interference. But his voice lacked conviction, and I could see the unease in his eyes. He warned me then, leave it alone, son. Some things ain't meant to be dug up. I wanted to listen, but by then it was too late. I was hooked. The Walkers weren't just a mystery anymore. They were a calling. That winter was the worst of my life. The nightmares intensified. I woke up drenched in sweat, the stench of decay filling my room. Once, I swore I saw a tiny white larvae crawling across my pillow, only to vanish when I blinked. Another time, I heard my name whispered just outside my window at 3 in the morning. My friends noticed a change in me, haggard, distracted, always looking over my shoulder. I pushed them away. I couldn't explain. How could I? The walkers were in my head, and the cabin was in my blood. The final straw came one night in February. I dreamed of the cellar again, but this time I wasn't standing at the top. I was lying among the bones, my body crawling with maggots. Sarah Walker crouched over me, whispering, "Join us." I woke up screaming, clutching my arms, convinced I could feel them burrowing beneath my skin. That morning I packed my gear. I wasn't going to wait for the answers to come to me. I was going back to that cabin. And this time, I wasn't leaving until I found the truth. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that the truth wasn't waiting quietly for me. It was already moving closer, creeping into my life like rot spreading through wood. And once I opened that door, there would be no way to close it again. The morning I set out for the cabin again, the sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that looked like wet ash smeared across the horizon. I had packed deliberately: a lantern, extra batteries, food, a canteen, rope, a crowbar, and my old hunting knife. In the side pouch of my pack, I slid in the small tape, recorder that had already caught laughter once before. I didn't know what I was planning. Part of me wanted proof, part of me wanted closure, but the biggest part of me just wanted to understand. The walkers' faces, even though I had never truly known them, felt branded into my skull. Every step toward the woods felt like walking towards something inevitable. The trail into the forest seemed darker than before, though it was only mid-morning. The pines arched overhead, their branches locking out what little light the sun had managed to muster. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until even my own footsteps sounded too loud. I thought about Harris, the old logger, warning me that the land spits people out. Yet the walkers had stayed. That thought gnawed at me. Why had they endured here? Even when Sarah begged for escape in her letter, what bound them to this patch of cursed earth? When I broke into the clearing, I stopped dead. The cabin looked worse than ever, but it wasn't just time that had eroded it. It was something else. The ground around it was blackened, as though burned, though there had been no fire reported. The porch sagged lower, and the windows seemed darker, like eyes watching me. For a moment, I nearly turned back. My body screamed at me to leave, but my mind shoved me forward. I set my pack down inside the doorway, the air immediately clinging to me like damp cloth. The cellar door was my destination, though I dreaded it. I lit the lantern, its glow spilling across the warped floorboards, and descended. The smell hadn't gone. Though the bones were gone, though the place had been emptied by deputies, the stink of rot remained deep in the timber. At the bottom, I swept the lantern across the dirt. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Beneath the layer of disturbed soil, etched into the very floor of the cellar, were more symbols. A circle big enough for a man to stand inside, drawn in soot or ash, its lines thick and jagged. Around it were more of those crude eye marks, pointing inward. I crouched, tracing the outline with my fingers. It felt wrong, warm even, as if the earth itself had retained some kind of fever. My recorder clicked softly as I sat on a shelf, pressed record, and began speaking aloud, narrating every detail. There are symbols here ritualistic. Looks like an attempt at protection or containment. My voice sounded strange, too loud against the silence. That's when I heard it, the faintest scrape behind me. I spun, lantern raised. Nothing, just shadows dancing on the walls. Yet the hair on my arms bristled and my chest went tight. For hours, I stayed in that cellar, documenting, sketching, whispering questions into the dark. Sometimes, I swore I heard whispers back. When I finally climbed the stairs again, the sun was gone and the woods outside were drowning in twilight. I sat at the table, playing back the tape, and what I heard made my blood run cold. Between my own words and the pauses, another voice threaded through, high, fragile, like a child's. It said one word over and over, stay. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the floor of the cabin, knife in hand, lantern glowing dim, heart hammering in my chest. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps above me on the roof. Slow, Deliberate. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. My throat closed, my body frozen stiff. I forced myself to rise, lantern shaking in my grip, and when I threw open the door, there was nothing. Only the trees swaying in a wind I hadn't felt before. The roof was empty, but the footsteps had been real. At dawn, I left, half crazed from exhaustion, stumbling back to town with the recorder clutched in my hand. When I played the tape for myself later, the footsteps were there, clear, and after them, another sound, the creak of the cellar stairs, as though someone was walking down after me long after I had gone. I didn't share the new tape with Dalton. I already knew what he'd say. Instead, I locked it away and tried to carry on with my life. But life didn't carry on. Every night, the voices grew louder. Every dream ended with me in that cellar circle. Sarah Walker's face pale in the lantern light, whispering. We stayed. Now you must too. I would wake with dirt under my fingernails, though I hadn't left my bed. Once, I woke to find my boots soaked as though I trudged through the woods in the night. That was when I began to suspect the truth, that the Walkers hadn't simply died in that cellar. They had been claimed by something. And now, whatever had claimed them had marked me too. I tried to convince myself that leaving the cabin behind would end things. That if I ignored the pull, if I buried the tapes, if I locked the notebook of symbols away in a drawer, the voices and the dreams would fade. For a few weeks, it almost worked. I went back to my job, filed reports, walked property lines, and pretended I was still the same man who had stumbled across that clearing by accident. But normalcy was a mask I wore poorly. My coworkers noticed the shadows under my eyes, the twitch in my hands. One of them, Jim, joked that I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I forced a laugh, but inside I wanted to tell him that was exactly what I'd seen, and worse. The dreams never stopped. Every night, I woke to Sarah's whispers. Sometimes I heard the children, too, their laughter echoing in corners of my apartment where no children lived. I kept finding small, inexplicable things out of place. My lantern, still packed from the cabin, sat lit on the kitchen table one morning, though I hadn't touched it. A handful of soil appeared on my pillow another night. The stench of rot would hit me in waves, sour and sweet, lingering in the air even when I scrubbed every inch of the place. I began to dread sleep, to dread silence, because silence always carried the voices. By spring, I couldn't deny it anymore. The cabin had followed me. Or maybe it was never about the cabin at all. Maybe it was the land, the curse, the hollow ones the old book described. I carried it inside me now, a sickness that no doctor could diagnose. I tried staying at a friend's house one weekend, hoping a change of scenery would break the spell. But the second night there, his dog started growling at the empty corner of the room. The tape recorder I had brought along clicked on by itself, capturing the sound of children running across hardwood floors that weren't really there. My friend asked me to leave the next morning, his face pale, his voice shaking. I couldn't blame him. That was when I decided I needed answers from the source. If the Walkers had been trapped, if Sarah had written about darkness moving in the woods, then maybe, just maybe, there was something left behind beyond the bones and the cellar markings. I spent weeks combing through auction records, land deeds, anything that could tell me about their past. Finally, in an old cardboard box in the county archives, I found a journal. Its leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the name inside was clear. Henry Walker. The entries began mundane, accounts of building the cabin, digging the well, planting the first crops. He wrote about how proud he was to live free of the corrupt systems of the world, how he would raise his children strong, unspoiled. But as the months passed, the tone shifted. He described hearing scratching on the windows at night, animals in the forest that weren't quite right, deer with twisted legs, coyotes that howl like human voices. Then he wrote about Lily and Thomas waking screaming, claiming a thin man stood in their room, watching. Sarah begged him to move, but Henry was stubborn. "This land is ours," he scrawled. "If something wants it, it will have to take it from us." The last entry chilled me to the bone. It was dated June 14th, 1996, the approximate time neighbors last saw the family. "It's inside now," Henry wrote, his handwriting jagged, desperate. "The children do not speak, only laugh." Sarah prays, I have drawn the circle. If we stay inside it, perhaps we will endure. If not, forgive us. I slammed the journal shut, bile rising in my throat. The circle, the one in the cellar. It hadn't been random, hadn't been ritual for show. It had been their last hope, a desperate act to hold back whatever had breached their home. And it hadn't worked. That night, I made a decision. I would return to the cabin one final time, armed with everything I knew. I copied every symbol from Henry's journal, every ward from the witchcraft book, every desperate sketch from the cellar beams. I packed salt, candles, rope, and the recorder. I wasn't going to investigate this time. I was going to confront it. The hike felt longer than ever, as though the forest itself stretched to keep me out. Branches clawed at my clothes. Roots seemed to trip me. Shadows slid where no shadows should be. By the time I reached the clearing, dusk had fallen, and the cabin loomed like a rotting beast. I lit the lantern, placed salt around the perimeter, and carried my supplies inside. The air was colder than winter, though spring bloomed outside. I descended into the cellar, heart hammering, and lit candles around the circle. I placed a recorder in the center and sat cross-legged beside it. My voice shook as I whispered, "I know what happened to you. Show me. Tell me." For a long time, nothing but silence. Then the recorder clicked, and in the stillness, the whispers began. At first, it was Sarah's voice, soft, pleading. "Leave, please leave." Then came the children, laughing, echoing, their joy warped into something cruel. The lantern flickered. The dirt inside the circle trembled, as if something moved beneath it. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced myself still. "What are you?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a croak. The answer came not as words, but as a sound, a groaning, hollow moan that filled the cellar, rattling the beams, shaking dust from the ceiling. And then, just as suddenly, silence. When I dared to glance at the recorder later, it had captured everything. Every whisper, every laugh, every moan. But it had also captured something else. When I played it back that night in my apartment, there was another voice beneath the others. Low, guttural, and human. One word, repeated 3 times. Mine, mine, mine. That was when I realized I hadn't just been listening to echoes of the past. Whatever had claimed the walkers was still there, and now it had spoken directly to me. I barely remember the days that followed. My body was in town, but my mind was trapped in that cellar. Every sound I heard, a door creak, the hum of the refrigerator, the drip of a faucet, felt like the cabin had followed me home, leaking into every corner of my life. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but the tape refused to let me lie. I played it again and again, the whispers, the laughter, and that word mind crawling beneath it all. Each time, I swore the voice grew clearer, closer, as if the distance between the recording and the present was shrinking. Sleep became impossible. When I did manage to drift off, I woke gasping, convinced that someone stood at the foot of my bed. The air would reek of damp soil and rot, and sometimes when I turned on a lamp, I saw shapes fading into walls, pale outlines of faces with hollow eyes. My body thinned from lack of rest. My hands shook constantly, and my reflection looked like a stranger. People began to avoid me, muttering that I looked unwell, unstable, and maybe I was. The breaking point came one night in July. I woke to find the tape, recorder running on its own, red light glowing in the dark. I hadn't touched it. The sound coming from it wasn't static. It was breathing, heavy, ragged, like something crouched just outside the circle of light. Then came the voice, not on playback, but live, spilling from the speaker in real time. "Stay. Stay with us." I hurled the recorder against the wall, shattering it, but the voice didn't stop. It filled the room, not from the broken machine, but from the air itself. I stumbled out into the night, barefoot, heart hammering, and didn't return until dawn. It became clear. Ignoring it wasn't an option. It wouldn't stop until it had me, the same way it had taken the walkers. The journal, the symbols, the warnings, they all pointed to one truth. The circle wasn't just protection. It was an invitation, a gateway. Henry had drawn it to contain whatever haunted them, But in doing so, he had bound himself and his family to it. They hadn't been hiding. They had been trapped. And now I had stepped willingly into the same prison. I became obsessed with the idea of breaking the bond. I scoured occult texts, folklore, even drove 3 states away to meet an old Appalachian woman who people whispered could see things. She lived in a crumbling house on the edge of a hollow, her eyes clouded with cataracts, but sharp in a way that cut through me. I told her about the walkers, about the circle, about the voice. She listened without flinching. When I finished, she shook her head slowly. "You open the door," she said. "And once a door is open, child, you can't always close it. All you can do is choose what side you stand on." "What is it?" I demanded. My voice cracked with desperation. "What killed them? What's after me?" She leaned closer, her breath sour with age. "Not killed. Federal. It feeds. Always has. Always will. Hollow ones, some call them. Others say it's the land itself. Hungry for souls foolish enough to stay. Your walkers. They drew the circle thinking they could fight it. But the circle just kept them inside the feast." She pressed a small pouch of herbs into my hand. "Burn this if you want a little peace. But understand, peace is not freedom. You'll carry it until it finishes." Her words haunted me more than the cabin itself. Peace, not freedom. That meant there was no escape, only delay. Yet even as fear gnawed at me, another part of me felt drawn back. Not by choice anymore, but by pull. Like the forest had hooked a line through my chest, reeling me in. By late summer, I stopped resisting. I packed my bag once more, lantern, rope, and fresh tapes, and I walked the trail to the cabin under a sky smeared with stars. The woods seemed to breathe around me, each tree bending closer, every shadow stretching long. When I entered the clearing, I felt no fear this time, only inevitability. The cabin was waiting, slouched and broken but alive in its silence. Inside, I descended directly into the cellar. The circle still marked the earth, faint but unbroken. I sat in the center, lit the lantern, and pressed record. "I'm here," I whispered. "If you want me, I'm here." The response was immediate. The lantern flickered violently, shadows crawling up the walls. The dirt beneath me trembled, and the whispers swelled until they were a chorus. Sarah's voice, the children's laughter, Henry's low mutter, and beneath them all, the guttural growl, mine. My skin burned as if 1,000 tiny insects crawled beneath it, and in the lantern glow I saw them. Faces forming in the dark, hollow-eyed and open-mouthed, watching me. I don't remember leaving. I don't remember the hike back. I only know that when I woke, it was in my bed, clothes filthy, recorder beside me. On the tape, my voice screamed for minutes straight, before dissolving into laughter. Laughter that wasn't mine. That was when I knew. The walkers hadn't vanished in 1996. They hadn't simply died. They had become part of it. And now, so had I. The tape haunted me. No matter how many times I told myself not to, I played it again and again, and each time it warped further. My laughter, if it was mine at all, grew deeper, less human, layered with tones I swear no throat could produce. Sometimes in the background, I heard things that hadn't been there in the cellar. The shuffle of small feet, a woman humming, a man's ragged sobs. It was as if the cabin hadn't just followed me home. It had brought its tenant along, their spirits hitching a ride on magnetic tape. People in town noticed the change. I lost weight, lost color, and my eyes sank into my skull. I quit my job at the hardware store after I found myself standing in the paint aisle, staring at a red swatch and whispering mine under my breath, oblivious until a customer backed away in fear. I stopped answering calls, stopped visiting my sister. Eventually, no one knocked on my door anymore. And still, the voices never left. I tried destroying the recorder, smashing into shards, but the sound didn't stop. It only moved. I heard it through the radio, through static on the TV, through the pipes when water ran. At night, the whispers gathered in my bedroom, circling closer with each passing day. Sometimes I woke choking on dirt, my mouth packed with the taste of the cellar floor, though I hadn't left my bed. Other times, I dreamed of the walkers. Sarah standing at the end of my hall, her eyes hollow sockets, the children crawling across the ceiling above me, Henry dragging himself across the floorboards, finger bones clicking against the wood. It was clear I was becoming one of them. But unlike the walkers, who had fought to keep the circle intact, I began to wonder if my resistance was the real mistake. Maybe that was why the cabin chose me. Not to fight, but to finish. The thought burrowed into me like a parasite. Maybe I had to return, not to escape, but to stay. Maybe the cabin wasn't a prison. It was a hive, and I was being called back to join it. I made the decision one storm-soaked night. Lightning split the sky and rain hammered the roof, and over the roar of it all, I heard the voice louder than ever. Come home. Not a whisper, not static, but clear as a man speaking in the room. Come home. My body moved before my mind agreed. I grabbed a lantern, rope, journal, and one last blank tape. The hike felt shorter this time, like the forest was helping me along, clearing a path. The air grew colder the closer I got, and when the cabin finally appeared, it wasn't the sagging ruin I remembered. For a moment, just a moment, I saw it whole again. The roof repaired, windows glowing with amber light, smoke curling from the chimney. I smelled stew cooking, heard children laughing. It looked alive, a family home. Then I blinked, and the illusion was gone. The boards were rotted, the door hung loose, and silence pressed from every angle. I went inside anyway. The cellar smelled stronger than before, decay and wet earth, sharp enough to sting my eyes. The circle was almost gone, eaten away by time, just a faint outline. I stepped across it without hesitation this time and set the lantern down. My hands shook as I clicked record. It's me, I said. I'm here. You can take me. The reply was instant. The earth shuddered. Cold wind spiraled through the room, though no windows were open. My lantern guttered low, shadows stretching until walls seemed to dissolve. And then they came. The walkers. Not in fragments this time. Not in glimpses. Oh! Sarah stood before me. Face pale and wrong. Lips stretched into something that wasn't a smile. The children clung to her legs. Their eyes empty sockets that bled darkness. Henry loomed behind them, his body bent at impossible angles, jaw hanging open. You shouldn't have come back, Sarah's voice echoed, though her lips never moved. I dropped to my knees, shaking. I didn't have a choice. You called me. Henry lurched forward, his bones cracking like branches snapping. We didn't call you, he groaned. It did. His hand, if you could call it that, pointed downward. The dirt writhed beneath my feet, like something massive stirred just under the surface. The ground split, a crack tearing open, and from it poured maggots, thousands of them, wriggling, seething, spilling across the floor. They swarmed over my shoes, up my legs, into my clothes. I screamed, clawing at them, but they didn't stop. The walkers only watched, hollow and silent. Then the voice rose again, not theirs, but the one I had always heard beneath them. Deep, ancient, vibrating in my bones. Mine. The maggots stopped crawling. They froze in place, then began to form shapes, clustering together until they made a face in the dirt, a massive, eyeless face that stretched across the cellar floor, its mouth yawning wide. And in that mouth, I saw not darkness, but movement, countless bodies twisting, writhing, as if swallowed whole and still alive inside. I knew then the truth. The cabin wasn't haunted by the walkers. They weren't ghosts at all. They were part of it, absorbed, their essence feeding whatever lived beneath. That was the fate waiting for me. Not death. Consumption. I tried to run, but the cellar door slammed shut above me. The lantern died. The last thing on my recorder is my own voice, screaming into the dark as the earth opened wider, and that endless mouth swallowed me whole. Yet here I am, speaking to you now. I don't know how. Maybe I never left. Maybe this isn't my voice anymore, but it's voice wearing me like a mask. Maybe that's what happened to the walkers. Maybe that's what happens to everyone who listens too long. And if you're hearing this, if you stayed with me through every word, maybe it already has you too.